It's been pretty clear for the last 3 years, really, that the public fisc in America faces major challenges, and that includes the public education system. That the steady increases we've grown accustomed to for all these years are at an end for the foreseeable future, and that what Secretary Duncan has now called the new normal has come upon us. It was indeed deferred for a year or so by federal stimulus funds, and now it's upon us. And you can see the consequences around the country, including some very dramatic ones, such as Providence, Rhode Island firing all of its teachers in order to rehire some of them, because that was the only way they could think of to deal with the budget crisis facing their school system. About 6 months ago, Fordham and the American Enterprise Institute published a book called Stretching the School Dollar. Copies are available over on the table on the side of the room for everybody to take with you if you don't already have one. Two of our panelists contributed chapters to this volume. I'm sort of proud to say that Bill Gates handed out copies to each of the governors at the National Governors Association about 2 weeks ago. This is an issue that we are intently focused on and will remain focused on in Ohio and nationally. As you perhaps know, the Fordham Institute has a national perch in Washington and an Ohio perch in Columbus and Dayton. We will continue with that sort of bifocal approach to look at this issue and a bunch of other issues, of course, in K-12 education going forward. Today is our, if I may say, debut in Northern Ohio. We've never been participated in an event like this in the Cleveland area, and are delighted to be here. Delighted that you came to share it with us. And delighted to bring a panel of two non-Ohioans and an Ohioan who know a great deal about this topic. They're each going to talk for 10 to 12 minutes, not more, I guarantee you, and then we'll have a conversation. Their biographies are in your folders, so I'm not going to take time to run through their accomplishments. I am going to note, though, that Nate Levinson, who's going to speak first, has run a school system. That Steve Wilson, who's going to speak second, has run a series of charter schools and written some very provocative books and articles on the topic, including a tantalizing chapter in our book. And that Paolo DeMaria knows Ohio well from the state perspective, from the K-12 perspective, from the post-secondary perspective, and we're going to go in that order. After they have finished with opening remarks and in a handful of PowerPoint slides that you can watch up here, we will resume the conversation. So without further ado, Nate, take it away.
That's me. Great to be here this afternoon, and as we said, we will jump right in because I was told I would not get even 1 second over 12 minutes, so I know better than that. If we're going to move into an era of not a lot of dollars, it may seem overly simplistic to say that we want to make sure we spend every dollar very, very thoughtfully. And as overly simplistic as that may be, it's been my experience, having visited and talked to probably more than 100 superintendents in the last 2 years, and that's actually not the norm. If you think about, as any organization, including a school system, to have an indicator or indicators of success, what are you trying to accomplish? Be it college graduation, ready for work. We're pretty good at that. I mean, most of us know why we have schools. Question is, do we have a really clear strategy of how we're going to achieve that? Or do we have a large compilation of things we do, many of which were being done before we got to the district, will continue to happen afterwards? And then, do we have really clear sets of priorities? Do we know exactly what matters most? I think a lot of people are probably thinking, yes, we do. And not to be rude, but my experience is maybe we don't. when I talk to educators, often I'm told, here's what really matters, Nate, reading. If kids read by 3rd grade, that's good, and if they don't, that's really bad. The quality of the teacher, that matters most. I mean, this is not radical stuff. And how do you make great teachers? Professional development, mentoring, lots of things. But here's the funny part. As we start approaching tight budgets, what are the first things we cut, at least what I've seen? Reading teachers, mentoring, professional development. That stuff is discretionary. Protecting the classroom, that stuff doesn't ever get touched or gets touched last. If you look at our actions, our strategy says if a student lives less than 10 minutes from a school, that's great. Or if we have a mediocre teacher who doesn't get much support, that's okay. Because as I see school districts wrestle with budgets, we work really hard to keep underutilized schools open so that they're really close to where kids live. And we do that at the expense of cutting the reading teachers, cutting the mentoring, cutting the professional development. Let me just skip right ahead. So the first issue was make sure we know what exactly we're trying to accomplish. Then the second big issue is if you're not going to have a lot of dollars, how do you make sure that every dollar counts? As all of us wrestle with making tough budget decisions, my sense is we make educated guesses about what's best for kids. And I think a lot of school boards, a lot of school leaders emphasize the educated part of that phrase. I tend to emphasize the guess part of that phrase. We really don't know for sure what is working. So one takeaway is in a time of tight financials, we actually have to make sure we're investing in our data systems and in our data itself so we can make vastly better decisions. And that's both student achievement data as well as financial data. This slide behind me is just a great example of this. This is a slide that took me maybe an hour working with a mid-sized district to put together. It is their investment in a strategy called co-teaching. You'll notice that in K-5 versus 6-8 versus 9-12, they have entirely different staffing models. One costs $135,000 per classroom, another $212,000 per classroom. Mind you, we're comparing this to about a $75,000 per classroom baseline. The district's been doing this for 20 years. It is their primary strategy for raising achievement of students with special needs, a group that's very near and dear to me. So you think if they've done it for 20 years, must be awfully good. They laid off about 186 people over the last few years while maintaining this effort. Here's the interesting part. In 20 years, they had never calculated how much it costs. The answer is $8.4 million, which blew them away. Second, they didn't realize that at the middle school it costs 50% more than at the elementary school. That surprised them no end as the superintendent turned to somebody and says, well, why do we do it that way? Dead silence. But the data that was most interesting in 20 years of doing this, the one bit of data they did not collect was whether it helped kids learn. And here's the funny part. Only half their schools use this. They didn't have money to do it in the other half, or they would. Brilliant, not me, brilliant guy came in and said, this is like the makings of a controlled study. Let's see how it works. Zero, let me underscore, zero academic gains versus the control group. They're looking at student growth data. They're controlling for socioeconomic. It just doesn't work. But it is the single largest expense. It is their single most central strategy. And it took them 19 and a half years before they bothered to see whether it was working. We can't afford to do that anymore, and we owe it to kids not to continue doing things that don't work. So if you, and before you know, you snicker and you say, I would never do that. We'd never do something for 20 years and not know how much we spend. I've probably talked to every week directors, CFOs, superintendents, and I ask them, how much money do you spend on reading? How much money do you spend on this? Is this working or isn't it? It is less than 1 in 25 that can tell me, here's what we do, here's what it costs. They never include federal grants, they never include special education. We're just really not that good at monitoring this very limited resource. One of the areas that I think really exemplifies what I call the black hole, it sucks everything in, and then when you look to see what's happening, you really can't see anything, and that is special education and ELL. Obviously critically important, but often exempt. The chart behind me, I'll explain very quickly. This comes from one of the best managed, highest performing school districts I've come across. They are financially savvy, they are academically successful in every area, except special education, in which they had no idea what was going on. They were told they had far too many teachers and they need a whole bunch more, special education teachers. I asked them, how many do you have and how much do they work each week? They kind of didn't know the answer to the first, a little insulted by the second. And they said they all work like 85–90% of the week, of course. Well, it turns out in most school districts, special education teachers make their own schedules. This is their schedules. On average, they work 64% of the week with kids. But like so many averages, a lot are in the 80s, and not too many people are actually average. And we had 10 or 15 people working less than half the week with kids. That is not helping kids or the budget. They didn't know this. All they knew is they needed more. Last chart to just really help drive home this idea that information is power, and during economic tough times, we need more information, not less. Benchmarking, comparing how you do things compared to others. This is a table from every school district in Massachusetts. How many paraprofessionals do they have adjusted for enrollment? Well, the first answer is it's all over the board. Some have 3 times as many as others. So the 2 questions you want to ask, is it helping? And the answer in almost every study we have read and every study we have done, the more of these you have, the less kids learn. Maybe somebody can ask me a question why that is later, but I don't have time to answer it now. The second thing that's equally shocking is these districts that are in the very, very high end. They actually think they're in the middle. They have no idea that they have a whole lot more than everybody else. They actually believe they are understaffed, want more of it, and their results have actually been not as good as the places that are in the middle or on the other end. What all of this kind of wraps around is, in our experience, we know what we know what we've done, and we're not nearly as certain about what others do. And mind you, everybody along this graph thinks everybody else looks just like them. We have actually called up the people on the high end and the low end and said, why are you high or why are you low? Is there a strategy? Is there a plan for doing this? And what we hear time and time again is, are we really high? We're low? It feels just normal to us. And I think we've normalized, districts normalize whatever they do. And I think the last and closing point is that question of how to do more with less. Here's the funny part. Some districts have already answered that question. This is not an unknown. It's just kind of unknown to us. And to go and look and study the people on the other end of this spectrum that have really high achievement and fewer staff members, or fewer this or fewer that, is going to be, I think, an important path forward, because some people, as I've said, have already figured this out, and we can learn from them. And with that, I think my time is up. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. So, listen, this is an opportunity that does not come around very often. I think in 50 years, maybe once a century, we have a chance to completely change what we do in schools. And wow, we know we need to completely change what we do in schools. We know this in many ways. We know this from looking at comparisons of international achievement. We consistently are absolutely in the middle of the pack, if not worse. We have mediocre results, and in our cities, we just it doesn't work at all. I think that's not an overstatement. I think we can agree on that premise. And so when we think about this fiscal crisis, I think we should look at it and say, this is an incredible opportunity to fundamentally rebuild what we do in our large urban school systems especially. So let's seize that opportunity. Let's not be led to the small changes. You know, we always hear discussions about cutting this small program or after school this or tightening up that. No, we need to break what we do now and start over again. And what does that mean? Well, first let's think about what we've been doing for the last 30 or 40 or 50 years. What has been our strategy of school improvement, and has it worked? And the basic strategy has been to decrease class size. That's been, if you think about it, the core approach to school improvement. And you know what? It doesn't work. Because if you think about our results over this period from, say, the 70s through today, we've consistently added more and more and more staff. We've made ratios smaller and smaller, and achievement has been flat, if not declining. So is there a way to fix this? Well, if we're talking about cost savings, we have to start with teacher expense. That is our overwhelmingly the largest expense. It's somewhere between 50 and 80%, depending on which district and how you count, of total spending. Could we deploy our workforce more effectively to have much stronger results? And what specific practical initiatives would decrease compensation costs and improve outcomes? So let's look first at this particular reform strategy of the last decades. We've increased student-teacher ratios from 15.3 to 17.3. I'm sorry, that's what I'm proposing that we actually do. We've had of course, much more radical changes in class size than that. But what I'm proposing here is let's actually go the other direction. We're going to have to increase class size. Let's not be fearful about it. It's actually going to have positive outcomes, and it's going to be relatively modest because small changes, small increases in class size have dramatic impacts on savings. And so if you look at that, you might, of course, be fearful. Well, class size, we've been so deeply acculturated to think, is the driver of better achievement, that if we increase class sizes, we're going to slip backwards. But the evidence doesn't suggest that at all. If you look at the largest studies of class size, beginning in Tennessee and then in California, where there was a statewide initiative to decrease class size, the Class Size Reduction Initiative, these huge investments, even in the most controlled implementations, have had no outcomes, no benefits. That's hard to face up to because it's what we've been doing wrong for so long. But instead, let's think about what other countries do. If we look at the most successful countries around the world that absolutely knock the socks off us in terms of student outcomes, do they have smaller class sizes or larger? Much, much larger, and consistently so. If you look at Asian countries, very often you have class sizes twice the size of ours, and yet their achievement puts us to shame. We can't restore America's standing in the world. We can't be equipped to lead again unless we fix our schools. And if we continue to think that the secret to fixing our schools is smaller classes, we're really horribly mistaken. And of course, with that comes, with increasing class sizes, we also have all kinds of attendant benefits in terms of reducing benefit costs, facilities, utilities, and so on. So how can we have teachers be much more effective, much more efficient, much more productive when managing larger classes? Well, there are many different ways to do that, and Nate touched on many of them. We have to measure what we're doing most of all. We have to have very frequent assessment, not measuring our end-of-year goals in terms of our progress towards state assessments, although that's important, but much more importantly measuring, have our students just learned what we just taught them? So we need curriculum reference tests that are frequent, that are not punitive, that are designed to inform teachers. We need a radical overhaul of our professional development approach. I completely agree that's the last thing we should be cutting, but we need to change what we do with PD. In the past, what we've done is we have a hodgepodge of ineffective one-shot training programs that are not aligned with our core instructional strategy. We need instead to be doing PD, which equips teachers with practical techniques that the most effective teachers use routinely. And for that, I would recommend really a groundbreaking book of the last year by Doug Lemov called Teach Like a Champion, that is one of the first attempts to codify what great teachers do. And he identifies 49 specific techniques. This is exactly what our ed schools don't do. They teach Piaget and Vygotsky and all this theory. They don't attempt to distill what great teachers do. And the good news is that it can be captured and replicated. We need to change what we do with our workforce. Right now we pay enormous sums of money, hundreds of millions of dollars, for two things that demonstrably don't matter. We're buying the wrong things. We're buying seniority and we're buying degrees from schools of education. If you look at the step and lane charts that are part of the operating system that I'm suggesting we need to blow up in our school systems, that's what we're buying. And neither one of those, additional education, formal education from schools of education, or seniority, have any relationship to teaching efficacy past about 2 years of initial teaching. So we need to think what we do about letting go of the least effective performers, and we need to do that with gusto and without hesitation. Right now, we systematically rotate the least effective teachers through our schools, hoping that they only spend a little bit of time in each one. This is an obscenity. So we've read about the rubber rooms where teachers that no one wants are sent off to. These lurid accounts are waking us up to these defects in what we've been doing. We've been running an employment system and not an education system for the last 40 years. We need to change what we do, and we need to put students first. And that means cracking the code of these basics. So we also need to think about the best teachers. Instead of paying for seniority and for degrees, let's pay teachers for their results. The best teachers should be paid dramatically more. And in this chapter of the book, I suggest how we can save 10, even 20%, and take an actual school district in the state of Washington and apply these particular initiatives that I'm describing to roll up to the total amount of savings that that district needs. And at the same time, we should be paying teachers much more. So we can do all of this. We can reduce the size of our workforce, which we simply don't need. We can modestly increase class size, and we can pay teachers more. That would make sense. If we're truly to recruit the best and the brightest, as opposed to routinely recruiting teachers from the bottom quartile of their high school class, we need to make this profession inviting and attractive to our top performing college graduates. And to do that, we need to offer a lot more money and a lot sooner. And it's quite doable. We can do both. We can combine that with other simple initiatives that are related, trimming costs for absenteeism, reducing and aligning benefits with private sector norms, introducing a teacher's fellow program so that we're recruiting, like the best countries, from the top graduates of colleges and universities rather from the middle or the lower schools. We also need to think about our curriculum. So the first piece is the operating system. It's the collective bargaining agreements. It's paying for seniority. It's all the things I mentioned. We also need to fundamentally change curriculum and pedagogy. And right now we have been investing, again, for decades. It goes under various different names depending on the fad of the year, but differentiated instruction. The idea that a teacher can successfully educate a random assortment of 20, 25, 30, pick your number of students who have huge learning gaps in their precursor skills, some of whom don't know how to add two digits together, some of whom are able to do fractions. that's crazy. That'll never work. We need to think more like a college, where if you sign up for Chemistry 2, it's assumed and verifiable that you have completed and mastered the skills of Chemistry 1. And so we should think about equipping our teachers with powerful intellectual property, powerful curriculum, powerful embedded assessments that allow them routinely to achieve much greater results with a class size that might be a little bit larger. And then we can combine that with what I might call culture building tools. We also take it for granted, I think, in urban schools that teachers are constantly dealing with low-level behavior problems, right? They're constantly saying, stop doing this and stop doing that. This is a huge waste of time, and it really doesn't have to be so. That is the typical urban classroom today for all of us that visit public schools. And it really doesn't have to look anything like that. It can be so much more orderly, so much more on task, so much more engaged, so much more invested. And they are tools available today by which we can routinely establish that kind of culture of high behavioral and academic expectations. So again, in wrapping up, and I think this brings us to the end, I think that this is really an opportunity of a lifetime. I think it's a thrilling time to be involved in public education, because in the face of this urgency, this necessity to do so much more with less, we actually have for the first time the opportunity, the license, the legislative opportunity, the contractual opportunity to break and reassemble the operating system of public education. Thank you very much.
It's great to be with you all this evening. It's good to see some friendly faces out there in the crowd. My name is Paulo Di Maria. I'm currently with Education First Consulting, but have just left the Board of Regents, where I served 2 years as Executive Vice Chancellor, and you can read this in my bio. But I was also the Associate Superintendent for School Options and Finance for the State Department of Education. And one of the things, the reason I left that position was I kind of swore off school funding. I didn't want to do school funding anymore, and it was largely because there were still so many people that operated under the fallacy that if we spend more, our students we will have better schools. And it's just fundamentally wrong. And I think it just kept being drilled in my head every time I'd come across a new study or a new report, or even my own experience visiting schools and so forth and so on. You would find, places that spent more and more and more and never really got any additional results. So I thought, I'm going to get out of this. So when Terry called me to do this seminar, my initial reaction, and a pretty common occurrence, is to say, I don't do school funding anymore. I don't want to do school finance. But it then dawned on me, not only because I love Checker and Terry so much and the work that Fordham's been doing, but it dawned on me that this really isn't a school funding panel at all. This is an organizational management panel. And that is where I think we can make a big difference in K-12 education, and that we are on a precipice to do just that. Largely being precipitated by this financial challenge. So I echo what Steve said about this is a truly exciting time to be in education. And now with the consulting firm that I'm with, I'm seeing more and more every day the types of innovations, the type of excitement that are making it that in this country. And part of my role in today's presentation is to point you maybe to a couple practical tips of what you can do once you leave this session and are driving home and saying, okay, well, what should my takeaway be? First, I want to make a couple points of frame of mind. And because I think when it comes to organizational leadership, the frame of mind of the people that lead an organization, board members, superintendents, principals, even teachers, and others within the organization who I still consider to be leaders in their own special way, is so key to the success of the organization. If you haven't read Arne Duncan's speech, The New Normal, I think it's included, a copy's included in your packets. I would commend it to you because he really lays out, and the point I want to make about that is that this is not a one-time thing. Don't deal with tomorrow's news, however that may play out for your particular district. Don't deal with tomorrow's news as, okay, we just have to tide ourselves over for another year or two. Let's do the short-term things, those strategies maybe we've tried before that'll help us just get past the time, and then everything will go back to the way it was, and our funding will be restored, or this, that, and the other thing. The new normal is a time of fairly long-term financial challenge. And I think the imperative is to find more and more ways that we can become more productive and still move the achievement needle upward and close achievement gaps, but recognizing that we're going to have to do that with fewer resources and certainly less growing resources. Which is my second point. Really, there are no short-term fixes here. This is long-term work, and this is hard work. If people think going into this, and many of you have much more experience than I do in actually doing it on the ground, this is not something where you have a recipe book that you just pull out and say, okay, here are the 3 things we need to do, and we'll be done with it. This is the takeaway from both Nate's and Steve's comments, really strong strategic planning, getting into the guts of what your organization is about, what your priorities are, what it is you want to accomplish, looking at your human resource management issues in depth. Both of those things can be very gut-wrenching for an organization to go through, because it means that you bring into question a whole host of things that have been sort of understood as the way we do business. So many times I hear people, they listen to new ideas and they read things, and their response is, well, we could never do that in my district. We could never do that at my school. And I would challenge those of you who may sometimes approach concepts like that and say, well, you ought to talk about it. You ought to have those discussions. You ought to look at those examples, because ultimately people will do those things and they will move past you and they will move to become more successful. The other thing is stay positive. I think so many times there's a malaise that can overcome an organization that's going through fiscal challenges, and I have never seen that kind of malaise be particularly productive. Stay upbeat. Talk about the good things going on in your district. Be open with people about the challenges that your district is facing. Find ways to energize people with good news and important improvements that are happening. And while there will still be instances and occurrences that happen that are not of the good news variety, I think maintaining a positive frame of mind is really important in these difficult times. This slide is really meant to say educate yourself. And I've thrown up here a couple of examples. I would suggest to you there are many more than these. I just recently completed reading Wendy Kopp's new book, A Chance to Make History. And my initial reaction was, okay, here's the leader of Teach for America. It's going to be a lot about Teach for America and their history and so forth and so on. And the fact of the matter, it's not. I don't care if you're a fan of Teach for America or not, there are really some strong lessons about what transformational organizational management is about in education, and the lessons that Teach for America has experienced through their work and the experience of many Teach for America alums who have gone on to work in public schools, who have gone on to work in charter schools, who have gone on to work in private schools, who have gone on to work in advocacy organizations. Lots of strong lessons about organizational management that I would commend to you. Stretching the School Dollar is a great book. I'll tell my little story about Nate Levinson. When I first got Stretching the School Dollar, I immediately opened to the table of contents. I scanned all the chapter titles because it's an edited volume, and I always look for the one that grabs me the most. His chapter was the one that grabbed me the most because it was about a real-life story of a superintendent dealing with a fiscal problem. And so I was just spellbound. I was engrossed in it. I was reading it. And, of course, I thought, oh, wow, this is really cool. And it talked about the mistakes he made and maybe some battles he took on that he shouldn't, and difficulties dealing with the board. And I thought, oh, this is really great. You know, and then I told him today, I said, I was really disappointed in the ending. But I'll let you read it yourself to understand what I mean by that. But there are great chapters in there about a whole host of different things happening in real time, very practical orientation to it that I think will be useful to you. And if they themselves aren't useful, it will turn you on to other resources that might be available. The other book I recommend is Change Leadership, A Practical Guide to Transforming Our Schools. I think it came out of the Harvard Education Leadership Project, but I have found it in the past to be a very detailed understanding of leadership skills that are applicable in transformational work in K-12 education. But again, I want to emphasize, don't limit yourself to these resources. Teach Like a Champion is a great volume. Lots of other good things are happening out there, being written about out there, and I would commend it to you. What are some of those strategies that you might think about employing? And so I'm going to highlight a handful of those. The first is, and again, there's a chapter about this in Stretching the School Dollar, unit cost analysis. Finding out what does it really cost to deliver an English class in the high school versus a math class versus a science class. What do your special education students and your special education programs cost you at a unit level? What are the cost differentials among and between your different buildings? What might then be the cost differentials among and between school districts that neighbor you, that you consider to be your peers? The need to do much more detailed, granular analytics. And one of the other things Marguerite Rosa does is analyze extracurricular activities and their cost differentials and trying to dig at why. Her point is, if you do unit cost analysis, you will typically find some outliers that will prompt you to ask, why is this number an outlier, and how do we either explain it and rationalize it and then continue with it, or do we bring it in line with some of the other numbers that we look at? Shared services. One of the things that Governor Kasich also has made clear since he became governor was that this budget was going to be difficult, so give me your ideas. And I think I've learned anecdotally that entities like the County Commissioners Association, the Municipal League, others have taken that seriously and have really put in front of the governor some options and ideas for improving shared service and collaboration. I know the ESC organization has done some of that work as well, and I think that is a pattern and trend that every one of you should think about. What are those things that if we did it jointly with a handful of other school districts or with all the other school districts in the state or many school districts in our region, what are those areas where we can leverage our buying power and leverage the capacity of our organization to do that further? Are those difficult conversations to have? They certainly are, because from time to time they mean you might be giving up absolute power over that function. But in the best shared service examples I've seen, every participating entity still has some power. And there are service level agreements that are put into place to hold the delivering entity accountable for their performance, and that those kinds of things should not be left unturned as you move forward. You've already heard some great comments from Steve about human capital management, and I would suggest to you that continues to be an emerging area. And there are really two sides of it, I think. One is around numbers, but then part of it is also around capacities and skill levels. And so I put up here two sites that came to my attention recently. One is www.schoolleaderstoolbox.org, which is really about developing extraordinary skills and capacities in teachers. It's written with a little bit of a charter school bent to it, but when I read it and went through it, it really has some powerful, powerful tools for improving teaching in schools. The other one is www.newapproach.org, which is really geared towards creating excellent principals. And I think we have spent a lot of attention talking about teachers, but the principal, the leader, the instructional leader of the school building organization is so critical to making sure that that organization operates aggressively and successfully, that paying attention to the quality of your principals is hugely important. This next one, data, and more data. You've heard it in both presentations, and I would commend it to you. We've got a lot of great data in this state, and we don't even begin to scratch the surface in terms of the way we use it. Financial data, outcome data, school districts collect more data than they utilize. Don't wait for the state to process the data, because the state is always like a year behind getting it. Talk to your own data people about what it is you have, how you can set up better information gathering to make sure when you put a new program into place that you're able to monitor what it's doing. The other thing I'm a big fan of is communication. So many times we don't talk to people about the challenges that we face, and the most innovative ideas can come from the least expected people. Have conversations with your teachers and your principals and your administrators and your community about the challenges that you face, and look to them to help you think through some of those challenges and what kind of ideas could be put into place, especially when presented with alternatives that might be, you know, less appealing to them. So don't be afraid. The other thing that we haven't talked a lot about are technology options. There's another great chapter in Stretching the School Dollar around technology. If you're sort of a newbie to those kinds of issues, there's lots of great resources. I'm a big fan of the Khan Academy. If you don't know what the Khan Academy is and what they're doing, you should. How it would apply in a school district setting, I think is still up for some debate and discussion and some thinking. But hey, it's a great resource and it's a free resource, and I would encourage you to look at it. The other one is the Ohio Learns Gateway. way, especially for AP classes and so forth and so on. The last thing I want to say is look at the Ohio Fiscal Data Project. You can download a spreadsheet, plug in your district. It will show you comparison districts on a number of metrics, like your average tenure of teachers, average salaries, all kinds of, if you want to do some real benchmarking, it's a great place to start because it can help show you where you might be working at the low end of the curve or at the high end of the curve and drive you to different points where you might want to pay some attention.
Thank you,
so,
Paolo.
Practical tips. Thanks.
Thank you all. That's already quite a lot to chew on, and I'm full of questions, and I suspect people in the audience are too, and we will get to you, and there is a mic here, and in a little bit we'll invite you to come to it and throw some questions at these guys. But I want to start with some specific questions, sort of one for each of you, even narrow. Paolo, do transformational educational leaders keep their jobs?
Well, you know, that's a great question, and I think the answer is they can, but I also think that from time to time there is a need for transformational leadership that one might know is transient.
Okay.
That said, I am not an advocate of the, you know, take no prisoners approach, but I think there are kinder, gentler, but tough, you know, sort of the tough love approach, which I think can move districts in a transformational path and still be sustained over the long haul. So, so I think it is possible.
But it might not be a bad idea to be ready to sacrifice a superintendent or two in the course of transforming the culture and practices and budgets of a school system.
And I think the other thing sometimes you see is people will plant transformational ideas that are immediately rejected on day one, but then over time, and they're great examples, over time become accepted and then adopted, and that ironically serves a purpose as well.
So Nate, I want a transformational idea for special education. You alluded to this in your remarks, and you've written about it in several places. Give everybody an example of a way that special education could be made more efficient, productive, or economical, or all of the above.
Sure. Here's one where you can do all of the above. The tradition in almost all of the school systems out there is if I have trouble learning, I get an IEP, and then I get routed to the special education department and their staff to help me learn. The problem with that, and let's take middle school and high school math as one of my favorite examples. I was in a regular math class. Good math teacher, majored in math, loves math, and that wasn't enough. I mean, I didn't learn very much. So the solution was to give me a lot of paperwork, a lot of forms and such, and then route me to a special education teacher in a much smaller class size, maybe 5 or 6 or 8 kids instead of 20, but a teacher who is not a math teacher. We've interviewed hundreds and hundreds of them. The vast majority of them hated math. So we've created a system in which the kids who need the most get teachers who are not actually the most successful, but the one thing we give them is a really, really small class size, a lot of attention. And that's actually not been very successful. So the districts that have really closed the achievement gap give kids who struggle great teachers. They give them more time, and it is like 90 minutes a day instead of an hour, but they don't have to give it in a really small classroom setting. It can still be 20, 25 kids, but with a really talented teacher. And the last piece, the way you define a talented teacher is very simple. Somebody who you can measure that the kids are learning what they just taught this week and today. And that is a vastly less expensive, vastly more successful route for kids who struggle.
Okay, thank you. Steve, you used the tantalizing phrase on one of your slides, culture building tools, and you were referring to things that included behavior and discipline in the classroom, issues like that. Give us an example or two of a culture building tool that exists that real schools or school districts might employ.
Okay, so I think the best example is the book that I mentioned, which is Doug Lemov's book, he lays out 49 techniques, and roughly half of them are really cultural techniques and the other instructional, but of course those are very much intermingled. And so a very simple one would be that the idea of the least invasive intervention. So instead of starting with a verbal intervention, as I mentioned earlier, which is, stop doing this by naming the kid by name, thereby stopping all of instruction for the rest of the class, diverting all the attention to that one student, encouraging him to do more of it, in essence, to intervene non-verbally, to walk up, to maybe put a hand on the back of the student or just redirect their eyes over there, whatever, and to proceed through a series of trainable interventions, beginning with the nonverbal and ending up with the nuclear, which is the verbal, specific, individual intervention. There are all kinds of things along that path that teachers can be trained to do first. The effect of even one simple technique like that is astonishing on the culture of the room.
Thank you. So all of you, you all talked about data. You made the point that the system is, on the one hand, awash in data, and on the other hand, deeply ignorant about how much it's spending, how one thing compares with another thing, how much output is produced by which input, things like that. How did we end up with a system that is, on the one hand, constantly generating data, and on the other hand, knows so little about itself in terms of what's productive? Was this willful ignorance? Is this the accumulation of just a bunch of compliance regulations? Where did this paradoxical situation come from? Anybody?
I mean, I think it is largely, I mean, data systems at their outset were designed for reporting.
Yep.
To the state, to the feds, this is, and for auditing purposes. And so once you get into a pattern then of that being the case, people don't become particularly innovative in terms of what they use those data systems for. And God bless a lot of the finance officers and their staffs. I mean, they're already taxed in many different ways that to find the time to do creative analytics around finance data and couple it with program data. I think that's the other thing, is many of these systems exist. The finance data is here, the performance system is here, our own assessment system might be at a third iteration, and there haven't been mechanisms designed to cross those systems together. Okay.
Go ahead, Nate, and then Steve.
I mean, I agree with that as a foundation, but I also think love gets in the way.
Love.
Love.
It gets in the way of almost everything.
It really does. That's what my wife keeps telling me. But a colleague of mine has done psychological profiling, things like the Myers-Briggs, the DISC inventory, on hundreds and hundreds of superintendents and principals. And one area that we score generally very, very low on is what they call the utilitarian, or the return on investment. And I'll just tell one really quick story, because I came out of the business world, if you didn't have a chance to read my bio or figure that out, before I became a superintendent. So I'm in front of my cabinet. They had proposed a pretty expansive program, and I asked the question, how many kids do you think this would help? And I told them, because it's about $8,000 per student that we're going to be targeting. And I said, how many of them do you think it would help? And my deputy, who I handpicked, turned to me and said, if you ever ask a question like that again, I am leaving. That is disgusting. If it helps one child, that is enough. He did leave because it wasn't enough for me.
Well said. Steve, what's your theory here?
I would submit a different reason than those two, although I agree with both of those. And it would be that we don't do anything with all this data because none of the things that we would like to be able to do are permitted to be done. Right? So if you were in business and you got the results of a particular program and it wasn't working, or let's take a more positive example, it was working, you would do more of it. So you might have a teacher, a very effective teacher might teach 60 students instead of 30. Or you might have a very ineffective teacher, you would let go of that teacher. But since school districts have been essentially prohibited from doing any of those things, That's the problem. So it's not that we don't know what is working and what isn't. It's not that we don't have pretty good data, although I think we could have much better. It's that we're not allowed to do anything with it.
So would that, for example, explain why it's so hard to find out how much one school's budget is versus another school's budget within a district? Because knowing that wouldn't make any difference, because the costs are generated by teachers that are assigned by mechanisms that have more to do with seniority than with school management, things like that?
Yeah, in fact, I think that's a great example. The way the data works and the way that we act on it obscures those things. So instead of sending districts a budget in proportion to the number of students that they're responsible for educating, the budget is prepared by a uniform number, a staff dollar amount, which obscures the fact that the most challenged schools actually have the least capable and the least expensive teachers, and the affluent schools have a much higher unit cost. So again, because the system isn't accountable and because the work rules don't permit reforms, these things are sustained, I think.
I learned the other day that the federal government is complicit in this too, with a peculiar provision of Title I called comparability. The theory is that poor kids are supposed to have as much money spent on their education by the state and district as rich kids within a school system, and the federal dollars, of course, are supposed to come on top of that. But since nobody has school-level spending data, the districts that have a, quote, uniform salary schedule for the entire district are presumed to be spending the same amount of money on the schools attended by poor kids as the schools attended by middle-class or wealthy kids. And the federal government believes that the comparability requirement of Congress is thereby satisfied. It's absolutely absurd, of course. But it's, and evidently one of the issues that coming up under reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act is whether that should be altered so that real data at the building level need to be generated about expenditures. But of course, to do that would require a profound change in most districts' budgeting systems. And that in turn would give rise to all sorts of other issues having to do with seniority and what authority does the principal have over the budget, and questions like that. I'm glad Paolo finally mentioned technology, because one of the things I was sort of fishing for, or waiting for really, in everybody's remarks was whether the adroit use of technology is a productivity enhancer, and or could be. And if it is, why aren't we doing more with it in our public schools? There's clearly a lot of it going on in post-secondary education, and certainly a lot of it going on outside the schools themselves, in the private sector, for example, and in industry and the military and so on. But my impression's been that public education's making actually very limited use of this. Should it be making better use of it for productivity enhancement? Anybody? Nate, you were...
Certainly, I'll go back to the slide of you have to have a strategy.
Yeah.
And I've been in great classrooms and seen great schools that are very high tech. And I've seen others where the highest tech thing is a piece of chalk. There are, in my opinion, lots of roads to greatness, but to take simply technology, ARA must have been the greatest boon to the smartboard manufacturers of America. I have seen them as I travel, put into every kindergarten, every lunchroom, every closet, and that somehow a teacher that didn't have a plan and didn't have student data and didn't have an overarching set of goals now has a smartboard. That's still not going to be a great classroom. So I come back to, you need the strategy, you need measurement, and I think some of those roads, let's face it, almost every other industry has used technology to increase productivity. But until you get the strategy, it's useless. And worse yet, I think for too many people, they believe the technology is the strategy, and it is not.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that, Nate. I totally agree with you. I think that one of my big fears is that what will come of this is there'll be a drive towards technology. And we've seen promises made by technology vendors in education for the last 40 years. It's always been that finally we're there, this technology is going to be transformative. And there really just isn't any evidence. So I hope people proceed very cautiously and don't have as their main investment or solution investing in educational technology.
Well, let me push back just a little bit. One of the interesting provocative papers in the folder is Paul Hill and Marguerite Rosa's paper on curing Baumol's disease. Baumol's disease, as probably you all know, is the proposition that labor-intensive industries cannot become more productive. And the quintessential example here is the string quartet. How can a string quartet become more productive? I mean, there's only 4 players, 4 instruments, the symphony takes, or the sonata takes the same amount of time, so forth and so on. And yet, it's been my impression, looking at the world of music, that they've actually become hugely more productive, in significant part through technology. They broadcast concerts now, they record concerts and sell CDs. You get digital access to it. I can listen to it on my computer while I'm doing something else. It seems to me that the productivity of the world of classical music is hugely enhanced through technology, including the string quartet. You don't take for granted that this would happen in K-12 education also. No. Steve is shaking his head. Nate looks very skeptical, and Paolo is nodding in some sort of agreement.
Well, I'm not going to apologize. I'm a big believer that technology can make a difference. But I agree with the point. It has to be deliberate, and it has to be a planned use. But more and more people are experimenting with what that deliberateness looks like, and I think we are seeing some outstanding models. And some of those models are in higher education that I think have some applicability
but
in the high school
I think there's a big difference, perhaps, right, in higher education, because typically where it's being applied successfully in higher education is with very motivated students who want to obtain a result and quickly. And I think that's very different than the problem in elementary and middle school, where there really isn't a record of these kinds of interventions being successful. But to your point, Checker, if you look at the say 200 top performing charter schools in the country that amidst the sea of all the others that are really not much better or sometimes worse, but the ones that are truly closing the achievement gap, virtually none of those, does technology play any significant part.
So well, I want to change the subject because I've got something I want to get onto thinner ice, actually, than technology.
Oh, look at the time.
I want to, first of all, ask this, and then I'll get into even more trouble. The 2 main reform strategies of American education for the last 20 years have, on the one hand, been, I'll call it standards testing and accountability, and on the other hand, I'll call it school choice in its various forms, charters and beyond. Are these luxury goods at a time of tight resources? Are these things that should have less spent on them? Are they realm for savings, or are they productivity enhancers, or are they neither or both? Anybody?
I continue to believe that there is a hugely important role for standards testing and accountability. I think we can look back at the years that we've gone through and debate whether we should have done things differently, approach things differently. People can still have honest disagreements about the current testing structure, but I think it has done a huge amount to focus K-12 education on the ultimate goal, which is to help students gain certain knowledge and skills over a period of time. And if we want to redesign and redefine our assessment protocols, we should. I'm a big believer in what the Common Core brings to the table, and frankly, some of the assessment work that's being done by the 2 consortia. So I think it's hugely important.
Okay. Anybody want to speak on behalf of choice?
If choice means freeing up the supply of schools, absolutely. If choice is just a demand mechanism for rotating students across an existing pool of schools, I think we know that doesn't do anything. But if we're freeing up the supply, truly allowing new schools to be created and chosen, I think that we absolutely should continue it. And just very briefly on the standards piece, where it's done well, so in Massachusetts, for example, where very ambitious standards were created, it's been miraculously successful. That state now has outcomes not just at the lower grades, but at the 10th grade level that are the equal of Taiwan. So if we have ambitious standards and good assessments, I think it absolutely works.
I won't let the audience wait in suspense to be told that you were there at the creation in the Weld administration, as I recall.
Didn't have much to do with that part.
Okay.
Checker, I'll weigh in too on the choice.
Okay.
Because again, I think, and I've increasingly come to the conclusion that different types of students will prosper in different settings. And I think there's something to be said for a variety of settings. Everything from, if you watched Waiting for Superman, the residential college preparatory kind of middle school, high school,
the Seed Academy.
The Seed Academy, to experiential-based learning environments like the charter school that my son and daughter went to the arts, arts-focused institutions like the Columbus Public Schools Arts Impact Middle School that my kids also went to. I think they're different. I don't necessarily want to call it learning styles, but places where students will thrive and prosper because of the different environments, and I think that begs for more choice options.
The other thing that's interesting, one of the promises of charter schools was they're going to try some different things and maybe we could learn from them. And I concluded my piece, my section, by saying that pretty much what you want to know, somebody has already done, and it's a matter of finding it. I spent some time looking at how very, very high-performing urban charter schools spend their budget. And it is so incredibly different than the budget I set as a superintendent or even when I was on a school board. And I see that some of these high-performing charter schools, the portion of their budget that goes to measuring student achievement, and these are the technical geeks who are running the computers and analyzing the data, vastly larger proportion. The amount of their budget that goes to professional development on a per-head basis, 10 times anything I ever imagined doing. And interestingly enough, the amount of management, the most popular, I was never considered a very popular superintendent, but the most popular thing I ever did was to cut administrators. Everybody claps when I do that. And yet, they are the people who help run the place, who give the guidance, who give the training, and the amount of educational leaders in a charter school, the proportion of the budget, is incredibly different than in typical public school settings. So I think there's a lot to be learned from these very high-performing schools, including how they spend their money.
Pause briefly on professional development, and then I'm going to go to my other thin ice question, but this may be slightly thin. You pledged allegiance earlier to professional development as an important thing to not cut. And yet I'm of the view that I've seen very little professional development in my life in this field that actually does anybody any good, and a fair number of snake oil peddlers out there getting high fees for what they call professional development. Help persuade me, Nate, or
Sure.
either of the other of you, if you want, persuade me that professional development actually accomplishes something.
Well, I see your form of professional development and mine are very different.
Okay.
In my world of professional development, there are no outsiders. What we did is, because we had really good student growth data, and I'll just take my favorite is elementary reading. Like Santa Claus, I knew who was naughty and who was nice. Every single teacher in my district, K to 5, I knew how much growth a teacher was creating in her students or his students. Turns out that the people who kind of walk the walk, strut the stuff in those faculty meetings were typically not the high growth creating teachers. But there would be these quiet, some young, some veteran, people who just made amazing things happen. We anointed them, paid them, gave them time, gave them this podium, and they were the professional development. Internal, proven success, no snake oil, and lots of hours. We knew that an okay teacher needed 50 to 60 hours a year with these really high-performing teachers as a coach, mentor, and trainer. And that takes some money, because time is money, but that really created great results.
The form you're describing might also be termed a kind of mentoring, might it not be?
It could be.
All right. All right, last question for me before we see if you all have questions. So if you do, please think about them and get ready to come up to the mic. And if nobody comes up to the mic, I'll keep going, but it's your turn. After I venture out on thin ice and ask you all the following. which is a particularly volatile topic in Ohio and several other states at the moment. Can the kinds of changes that you have been suggesting ought to be made, get made within the framework of collective bargaining as it is commonly practiced?
So I'll take the bait.
Okay.
Checker. You know, in my history, I have seen school districts with tremendously fantastic relations with their unions get some amazing things done. I've also seen those instances where unions have approached their work in a way that is very adult-centric and have not been open to changes. So sometimes I'm not convinced it's a union versus non-union thing. And I think the one conclusion I came away from what I was able to observe is that smaller union settings seem to be more nimble and more flexible and more willing to engage because everybody seems to know everybody else. And I think a relationship that exists between people is the strongest way to get. So I think it is doable. And I've also heard a lot of principals operating in union environments that when I've asked them, how did you create an organization that is really aligned around your beliefs in a union setting? They gave me some very concrete strategies about not only evaluating, but counseling teachers, out of their organizations, and really creating the environment that attracts people to them. Some interesting, So I think it's doable. That said, I think there's opportunities in a different environment to do things as well. So I don't know that it. And those may accelerate people that are reluctant to raise them in a collective bargaining environment.
Well, I think if you break that question into two different components, one is a cost component and one is a learning component. Certainly teacher benefits, I mean, it's been in the news every day. Those kind of things just make it harder to balance a budget. And certainly negotiating teacher benefits is one of the least pleasant things I have ever tried to do. But the flip side is, I talked about love getting in the way and the culture. I had a contract that said, for the first 3 years, you don't have tenure. In Massachusetts, I don't even have to write on a piece of paper why I did not renew you. I could write, I don't like the color of your eyes. I mean, I had total latitude. And yet, with this total freedom, my district, prior to my arrival, 99.99% of all teachers got tenure. Trust me, they weren't 99% perfect. When we started collecting data and knew that we had a third of our non-tenured teachers had 0 or 10% of their kids making a year's worth of growth for the last 2 years, more than half my principals said, she's a great member of the community. Her mother is a teacher. She comes to all the faculty meetings. She bakes cakes for people's birthdays. They're lobbying to give this person 30 more years of employment in my district. It wasn't a union contract that was going to put in a teacher that shouldn't have been there. So I think the cost side, the unions definitely raised costs. But if they went away, I'm not convinced that the learning side would necessarily accelerate.
Those are expensive cakes.
That they are.
Steve, do you want to weigh in on this one?
Well, I think the answer is no. I think it's really painful to say because I think in the broader context of the culture with incredibly rapidly accelerating income inequality and decline of labor in America, I think that these are huge problems, but I have to say that when it comes to schools, the existing collective bargaining agreements and the existing bargaining process, I think, is incompatible with serious reform.
Okay, your turn. There's a mic. You want to come up to it? Yeah, please. It would help, and maybe not everybody has a loud voice. It would also be great if you would identify yourself.
I am Dennis Kowalski. I direct the Greater Cleveland Educational Development Center here at Cleveland State University. The less is more suggestions that you've made deal with the trenches, the buildings, the school districts. There are some significant personnel costs at some of the support agencies, the State Department of Education, the educational service centers. Observations, comments about that in this idea of more with less, or finding more to do, finding something to do more with.
You mean the portions of the education budget that are outside of the school buildings?
Right.
Okay. Start, Nate. You're the former
sure.
local soup.
Let me talk about educational service centers. We've done some work here in Ohio with a really great educational service center. We've been working with about 18 districts. Their question was, how can we do more with less? And at the end of about 6 months, we said your educational service center is probably a really valuable tool and partner in making that happen. Before everybody runs out to their educational service center, flip side is we have worked with, and I have been a member of, other regional service centers that are absolutely less for more. We used to refer to them as country clubs. I mean, they don't have necessarily the same economic pressure. Real quick story, I was on the board of one. We shut down a program. You know, Steve was saying how hard it is. We shut down the program because the districts didn't need it anymore. Congratulations, I felt good. I'm reviewing next year's budget. I asked the director, I said, God, it must have been a terrible process because I know how hard it is. 29 teachers in that program, all the support staff. And he didn't look as bruised as I usually look during budget season. And he said, oh, I didn't let anybody go. I just added them to all the other programs because we get to charge on a fully loaded cost basis, and it wasn't fair to let those people go. They hadn't done anything wrong. So the regional approach isn't per se good. It can be great if you can set up the right incentives and a culture of what I often refer to as a culture of entrepreneurialism, where the service center has to go out and earn its keep.
Earn its keep by providing useful services.
At a competitive price.
Yeah.
I think that particularly in a state like Ohio that has a lot of small and mid-sized districts, there's a huge benefit if done well.
Paolo, you were part of the overhead for a while in Columbus.
You know, and again, I'm an advocate for, you know, the relentless pursuit of inefficiency and waste wherever it may occur. I am not anti-state departments of education because I think there are services that are provided, you know, including computing how much money should be sent to every district that are hugely important, and a whole host of other things. So again, I think there are plenty of areas where improved productivity can be found at the state level, at the regional level, and that those questions ought to be asked in a very deliberate and diligent way.
I don't know whether anyone asked Secretary Duncan what is the new normal at the U.S. Department of Education with its, last time I looked, 4,000 employees and a rising budget. It'd be very interesting to pursue that someday. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name's Dan Wilson, Chief Financial Officer for the Mentor Public Schools.
Which schools?
Mentor.
Thank you, Mentor Public Schools.
The presentations of discussion have included two topics I think a lot about, and I very much appreciate your help on my thoughts on that. The first deals with how to determine the correct unit of analysis. It seems by default and by kind of historical data use, it always comes back to a per pupil amount. And I'm not so sure that's the right unit of analysis. I'm thinking a lot about the classroom as a unit of analysis, or a program more so than the per pupil, and yet even Ms. Rosa's most recent work kind of defaulted back to the per pupil notion. The other is a newer thought, and it has to do with collective bargaining and the very real potential that we're going to throw salary schedules out and kind of start with a blank piece of paper to determine a merit pay structure for teachers. And I also subscribe to the belief that the highest quality, the brightest and best folks command competitive salaries. But I'm not quite sure in this environment how we arrive at a new compensation structure that will ensure the best and brightest are in the classroom.
Two softballs. What's the appropriate unit of analysis for economic and productivity examinations? And what's the alternative to step and lane salary schedules?
I'm still a big fan of the per pupil one now. And again, I think Rose makes a great case for it. I think there are other units. You know, obviously, transportation might be a pupil mile, food service might be meal served, space, cost per square footage. But even cost per square footage, if the buildings aren't occupied, have their own challenges. So I think you could be creative in defining your units somewhat differently. But I think when it comes down to ultimately instructional costs, it's hard to argue with a per student kind of approach.
Nate?
Let me argue. I think you need multiple measures. I mean, that's not an out, but it's really based on what decision are you making. The district I gave the example of had made a decision to do co-teaching. So to me, the question was, what did that strategy cost? If you have a strategy of small elementary schools or neighborhood elementary schools, whatever is the unit of decision making, that's what I want to be measuring so that I can then compare all my different strategies. And yes, it may get back to a per pupil within that strategy, but then I also think you need to divide it by some measure of academic gain. I would happily spend 3 times as much for 4 times as much learning. What really drives me bananas is spending even a penny and getting no learning. So it's that return on investment, which I know is generally considered an awful concept, or at least the awful phrase, but you have to divide by the learning to get a return on investment in the school setting. And
yeah, Nate, I totally agree with you. We shouldn't be measuring outputs. We shouldn't be measuring either inputs, which is how much we spend on something. That alone doesn't tell us anything, right? We need to, what we're interested in is the outcome. So maybe the right measure is spending per student made proficient. If we believe in the standards now with the Common Core, then that's a really useful measure.
Yeah, so why don't you get to the incremental learning? The other thing, just to qualify my student analysis, I'm also a big believer in risk adjustment. In other words, recognizing that it takes a greater investment of resources to a student who may be 2 grade levels behind than it may be for and some of my own analysis have tried to capture those notions of risk adjusting your student makeup to accommodate it.
So back to Steve with the second half of the question. You've had the fortune to lead some groups of schools that I presume didn't have fixed salary schedules. What did you use instead? Or what should people use instead? Maybe you don't like what you used instead.
Well, I think the first thing is to differentiate the roles. So not all teachers are paid the same amount, and they're not paid simply because they've been there longer or have degrees. So the first thing you do is you definitely, I don't see anybody who's getting results paying for seniority. That's just, I think, flushed away pretty universally in high-performing schools. And I think that it goes back to differentiating roles, paying a lot more for the kinds of things that Nate was talking about, people who take on additional responsibility, coaching other teachers, or in these many different roles that might ordinarily be called administrative, but really are academic operations, academic coaching. Those are vital roles, and they should be paid a lot more for teachers that are willing to take them on.
But if I may, what you're describing is a different kind of a salary schedule that would be organized around role. Responsibility rather than around performance. I think the question was asking also whether, how you would do a performance component in the salaries, if at all. And go ahead, Nate, if you're ready.
Sure. In Houston, they did a very interesting, I think very powerful, and certainly by our measure, very successful performance pay. The 2 things they did in Houston, first was what was called a forced ranking. So 25% of the teachers were going to be the 25 most successful. I mean, that's always going to be the case, and the next 25 and after that. So it did create a culture, and some people will hate this, some people liked it, of saying you are in fact better than somebody else. It's funny, in Houston, they do that with the football team every week, and they're very comfortable with it. So the first piece they had was a forced ranking with real money attached, $5,000 to $10,000. But I know the superintendent fairly well who put this in. And what he will tell you is that the single most powerful change that the merit pay created was what they were measuring the merit on was student growth. And he said every single person in that district, virtually everybody, who couldn't even hardly get their head around student growth, knew everything there is about student growth within about a year. And that it, as a way of communicating in a very large system, I think they're the 7th or 12th largest school district in the country, to get a message that we care about student growth, which is a different message than caring about state proficiency, even though it did dramatically increase state proficiency. He said it was a tool for culture change. It was the most powerful thing he'd ever seen. And that is something you want to think about.
We'll have to save for another day the nuances of measuring student growth and the different issues that come up in that connection. In our closing minutes, we have 2 more questioners. Perry White, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name really is Perry White. And
you are?
I'm a founder of Citizens Academy, a charter school here in Cleveland. And my question was about how crazy is it to try to measure per unit quality of academic growth, and the conversation went there. But as long as I'm up here, I thought I'd ask a related question, which is what's some of the political potential or educational potential and political, what are some of the political challenges to develop and apply such measures in policy making, budgeting, et cetera?
Restate the question.
In other words, we're talking about the concept, and Steve mentioned one way of doing it in terms of percentage of children that are proficient. It could be growth, but how valuable would it be to education reform to have that be central to how it's discussed and therefore how it's measured?
Okay.
I think it's about the quality of the measures, right? If you have good standards, or really it's more important that you have good assessments, because it doesn't matter what the standards are, it matters how they're measured or whatever is being measured. But if you have very high quality assessments, as you had in this instance of Massachusetts, then it's terrific. Whether you link it back or not to pay increases, I think is almost not beside the point, but that's a really tough cultural call to be decided school system by school system. But to have that kind of absolute stark clarity about which rooms are succeeding in getting to proficiency and which are not, and why, and being able to compare in real time very quickly, not 3 months later when the students have already been hurt, but immediately, and then to be able to act on it through professional development or ultimately switching out the teacher. I think it's absolutely game-changing.
Yeah, but I mean it more in terms of the economics than obviously, I mean, absolutely in terms of informing instruction, but in terms of macro education economic policy.
Well, when you say macro
I'm just talking
economic
about
policy,
how much money
yeah.
when people ask for more money,
yeah,
right? Not, the conversation has been, it's never enough,
right,
right?
Yeah.
So that conversation's going away.
Right.
But we have an opportunity here to really have data where we can start to, demonstrate what's worth.
It would reveal that there's no
investment.
correlation between high spending and high proficiency levels.
So it's a pretty potent tool if we
Absolutely.
can agree on it.
Last but not least, I knew he couldn't restrain himself. Terry?
Well, this is fascinating. So we last week had Eric, Professor Hanushek from Stanford University in Columbus, and we were meeting with folks. And he kept making this point. If we can replace the nation's 5 to 8% lowest performing teachers in America with just average teachers, our student performance would match that of the world's top performing nations. And so I guess the question is, how do we begin to tackle that challenge? That seems like, okay, we have a sense of what needs to happen here. That seems almost doable. How do we go about doing it?
Well, can I just submit step one? Having
Sure.
a meaningful evaluation system, right? Most districts have farcical evaluation systems where everybody is evaluated as good or great. So fixing that is step one, and then everything else follows from there, I think.
Go ahead, Nate.
I also think, though, I've met a lot of teachers. I've never met one who came to work thinking, today I'm going to be highly ineffective. I'm going to work for 6 hours with a bunch of kids for not the most amount of money and not necessarily the nicest boss. And I just want to really throw some garbage up on the board, and if they don't learn, tough. I mean, teachers care intensely, and the ones who are incredibly ineffective care intensely, but they do not know they are ineffective. And even with an evaluation system in which we force ranked people, my experience has been that they won't believe the system. You know, if it's just a principal's judgment based on observation. So I think I keep coming back to measuring student outcomes in a meaningful way. Yeah, there's a lot of problems and people can debate the nuances, but I'm positive that not measuring is definitely worse than all the nuances of the different ways to measure. And my experience has been that if a teacher genuinely knows and believes that what they have been doing isn't working, there is a great motivation to actually learn to be a better teacher, or in some cases to actually stop being a teacher. But until we can measure in a fairly unambiguous way success, we're going to continue to fool ourselves.
Okay, John is coming up to close us out. Before he does, or as he does, let me first remind you that there are copies of the book that we've been referring to over on the sideboard. And let me also invite you to join me in thanking 3 terrific panelists.
And for moderating the conversation. Once again, I want to just thank quickly the Lozick Foundation, the Jennings Foundation, Nordson Corporation, and the Stocker Foundation. In addition, John Mullaney and his staff at the Nord Family Foundation for their support, and the many staff members here from the Fordham Institute as well. As we wrap up, the book has been mentioned. The takeaway, as Paulo mentioned, as you drive home and digest this, and if there are more comments to be shared, the civiccommons.com, who has been broadcasting live from this venue, but that conversation will be continuing in the days and weeks to come on their website. So thank you kindly.